Go ahead, Bill.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. WebEx, in its wisdom, sometimes mutes you when the session starts. But if you're hearing me, then I'm very glad because we're looking forward to a discussion today with three very well qualified speakers to talk to us in the form of Guy Saint-Jacques, Sarah Kutulakos, and Rob Stewart. The session, as you know, but just let me advertise, and there it is on the screen, Recalibrating Relations Canada's Ties with China and the Asia-Pacific. And thank you very much for joining us. By way of introduction to the topic, I don't think it's necessary for me to say very much. It's appropriate, I suppose, to say that we do have a very important intersection here of economic and geopolitical interests, among other things. And just by way of the C.D. Howe Institute's interest in it, we are, in fact, the roots of the organization are in international trade. It's always been a central focus of our research agenda. And even if it weren't of historical importance for us, trade has been such a key driver of Canada's economic prosperity and living standards over time that anybody who's working on those topics can't help but look at it closely and be struck by some of the challenges that we are now facing in Canada when it comes to pursuing prosperity, but at the same time, taking account of a world in which trade and other economic and other types of political relations have become intertwined in a way that really is unprecedentedly complex. And it's not a central topic for us now, but I'll just mention trade sanctions, the use of economic sanctions for various reasons. We are now in a completely different world from what I think just about all of us on this call grew up in. So we are on the record today. It's probably worth mentioning that or stressing that because we do many C.D. Howe Institute events off the record, but for a variety of reasons, today seems sensible to be on the record. And so please conduct yourselves accordingly. As you will have seen in the materials for the event, our speakers have an impressive array of accomplishments and credentials, and I'm not going to do justice to them because my job now, having made a few opening remarks, is to ensure that they take the stage quickly. But Guy Saint-Jacques is, among many other things, a former Canadian ambassador to China. That is not the sum total of his career in the Foreign Service. He served on many continents in many countries, and he has also been a public figure on Canada-China relations since leaving the Foreign Service, and we're delighted that he is a fellow with us at the C.D. Howe Institute. Welcome, Guy. Thank you for your contributions, and thank you for being with us today. Sarah Kutulakos joined the Canada-China Business Council in 2007. And it's been a very busy and influential council for all kinds of reasons that you know. Her background is in the private sector, and she has extensive experience in China. And Sarah, we're delighted that you're with us. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your contribution. Our third panelist, Rob Stewart, Deputy Minister of International Trade, no stranger to the C.D. Howe Institute stage. He has one of those public service careers that makes me, at any rate, and I trust you as well, think very good things about the quality of the federal public service. Many years at the Department of Finance, and he has worked in other areas of the federal government as well, and is well known for his incisiveness and his wisdom. And so, Rob, it's a pleasure to have you with us again. If I have handled this right, that was the speaking order in which I introduced you. And it's my job now to turn my video off for the prepared remarks, starting with Guy. And without further ado, that is what I will do. Thank you, Guy. It's over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. So today I will try to give you an overview of the China of President Xi Jinping, a quick look at bilateral relations and the consequences for Canadians doing business in China and in Asia Pacific in general. So starting with the bilateral relationship, despite the release of Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels in September 2021, I would say that our relationship with China is still very difficult with almost no political dialogue. And I would say that this is due in part to the bad chemistry between President Xi and Prime Minister Trudeau, as evidence at the last G20 summit in Bali last November. And China keeps saying that Canada must learn from its mistakes and stop being the lapdog of the United States. The relationship is unlikely to improve after the publication by Minister Joly last November of the much awaited Indo-Pacific strategy, which says that China is a disruptive power and Canada needs to reduce its dependency on the country. And while the strategy does not, and in my view, cannot call for decoupling, its message to companies is clear. Yes, there are business opportunities in China, but you do business there at your own risk. But we will help you to develop new markets in the region. On the other hand, if I look at the trade figures, well, the trade is doing very well. We had record exports last year to China of 28.7 billion, plus 2%. But in fact, it was 51.6 billion if you include gold that went to China through Hong Kong and crude oil that went through the US West Coast. So this means that some 6.7% of our exports go to China. On the other hand, imports total 100 billion, 14% of our total imports come from China. And this means that we have a big trade deficit. If you look at the composition of trade, well, our exports are dominated by commodities and agri-food products. In fact, the share of our natural resources exports to China from 2009 to 2022 has been 74.2% on average, while it was 51% on average to the world during that same period. And if I look at the figures for January and February, in fact, an increase of 50% in our increase to China to 5.3 billion, but it's the growth is mostly related to jumps in iron ore and agri-food sales. And by the way, last year, our exports to India jumped by 78.4% to $5.34 billion. So if I turn now to the China of Xi Jinping, he has now absolute power and authority, but he remains very concerned about national security, and national security means the survival of the Communist Party, and he is concerned about the international situation. His goal remains to make China the greatest superpower by 2049 and achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese state. And despite having in place a comprehensive repression system with almost no freedom of expression, we saw last December the fragility of the regime when people fed up with confinement measures dared call for Xi's removal. And since he came to power in 2012, Xi has run an aggressive foreign policy with repeated use of coercive measures to punish countries that oppose its views or criticize it. China has also ignored international rules when they are not to its liking. It has launched the Belt and Road Initiative to increase its influence on developing countries, and it's a lot more active in international organization, and that's to fit its ambitions and neutralize critical voices. While China has no formal alliance, it uses partnerships that come close to that with, for instance, its indefectible friendship with Russia. It's also pushing for the renminbi to become the currency of choice to settle trade accounts among BRICS and developing countries. On the economic side, it is trying to deal with an aging and shrinking population, an important and growing public debt, a real estate sector that is slowly recovering but still facing challenges, a lack of confidence from private entrepreneurs who until recently created 70 to 80% of jobs in China. They may be staying on the sideline after the crackdown that on tech companies that happened a few years ago. China is also faced with big environmental problems and disenchanted youth faced with an employment rate of 19.6%, and also the trust in the Communist Party has been dented by its COVID-19 lockdown policies and its abrupt exit. So in terms of doing business with China, yes, there has been progress in recent years, such on intellectual property, but China remains very protectionist, and as confirmed by polls taken by foreign business associations operating in China, it does not apply rules in a consistent fashion, among other things. When I served in Beijing, I spent a lot of time trying to resolve problems experienced by Canadian companies. Yes, there is a growing middle class that may want to buy our products, assuming our prices are competitive, but it will remain a difficult market with some risk, for instance, sanctions depending on the status of bilateral relations. Sectors identified in the 5-year plan, like clean technology, clean energy, also offer opportunities for Canadian companies, but they should avoid becoming too dependent on that market. In terms of supply chain, there was an article last Friday in the South China Morning Post saying that in the first quarter, exports from foreign manufacturers in China have declined 16.3%, which may reflect the fact that companies have started to move part of their operations to other locations, mostly in Asia. And in terms of the service industry, let's hope that Chinese tourists will start to come back and that Chinese students will remain attracted by the quality of Canadian education. In terms of investment, large Canadian pension funds have learned their lessons from the sanctions imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. As an invasion of Taiwan remains a possibility, they are revising their portfolio to reduce their vulnerabilities. So in conclusion, what we are seeing is the remaking of the international order and of global supply chains led by China with an alignment of authoritarian regimes. This could result in major changes and, of course, higher costs for consumers. I call for, in the IPS, Canada needs to work more closely with allies to counter China's egregious behavior and minimize attacks on its values and interests. The message to China should be forthright. We are ready for a constructive engagement as long as it respects international laws and its commitments and stop acting as a bully when a country does not follow its diktats. Also, there should be zero tolerance for interference or spying activities in Canada. I hope that the Indo-Pacific strategy meets with success, as we have long neglected this region of the world, but let's not kid ourselves. It is a very ambitious strategy, and its implementation won't be easy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You were very precise as regards time. As moderator, I lead with that, but it was not the most important thing to say about your presentation. Very sobering, and thank you for giving us some key elements of the landscape when it comes to the economics, trade, the nature of Xi's regime, and some of the challenges for Canadian business. Sarah, I don't know that really sets the landscape entirely for what you were intending to say. So you are certainly welcome to set your own landscape, and we look forward very much to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to CD Howe for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with Yi and Rob, and I know that the three of us all look at China with different lenses, and my lens is purely economic. The organization I lead, the Canada-China Business Council, has a mission to ensure that more and better business happens between Canada and China, and as a registered Canadian nonprofit membership organization, we are both non-governmental and nonpartisan, and we work with whomever is in government to ensure that Canada prospers in its economic relationship with China. So where is that relationship today? I like to use a water analogy, with the geopolitical environment being kind of like an ocean with rough waves and high winds. Below that, the Canada-China government relationship is frozen in a block of ice. And after Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels went back, it feels like it froze even more solidly, which Guy alluded to. I think there are real cultural differences as to, do we put things in the past and move on, as the China side seemed to want to do, or do we, do we really stick to our guns that this was wrong and bad and we won't forgive? Below that block of ice, there are rivers flowing via people-to-people connections and business connections. And trade is definitely still flowing, as Guy said. And now that we can travel to China, things should improve, at least for business. And today's announcement that China no longer requires a pre-departure PCR test helps even more. And this resumption of travel has a direct link to the theme we've set at CCBC for 2023, which is Canada's competitiveness. Our survey 2 years ago of Canadian business was concerning on the competitiveness front. And that survey had three primary conclusions. One, China has always been hard, and over the past 2 years, it had gotten even harder. And that's because of the political environment, which had not gotten better since the 3Ms returned home. And then you layered on COVID-19 and it got worse. Canadian companies have been disproportionately impacted, and they showed profitability and other measures that were significantly lower than our European, American, and British counterparts. But what we did find is within those Canadian companies, those who are operating in China have weathered the storm better than those who were doing business from Canada. Those companies were more profitable, less pessimistic, and more likely to plan expansion over the next 5 years compared to companies who did not operate in China. However, there are many Canadian firms that have not set up these in-China operations, instead having relied on executive travel, which means that for more than 3 years, that travel wasn't happening and that business wasn't being developed. In that 2021 survey, of the top 15 obstacles that were cited, Canada-China relations was number 1, US-China relations was number 2, movement of people was next, and competition level came in at number 4, and that was up from number 7 in the previous survey. So what can companies do to be more competitive? I'd put having boots on the ground as the number 1 action a company should take. And it's something we see the American and European companies having done earlier than us, partly because many of those companies are bigger. And that doesn't mean a full-fledged company registration in China, but there are ways to ensure that somebody's looking out for your interests exclusively and building trust with your partners and ensuring your IP is being protected. For example, over the past 3 years, 13 Canadian organizations have used what we call CCBC's China proxy services to hire or house their China employees within our team. And they range from industrial and technology companies to financial services to winter sports companies and educational institutions. And we know that for a Canadian company to be a global company, it has to sort out China. Recently, a CCBC member was told by a large client, if you can't supply to me everywhere I do business in the world, including China, then I'll have to find another supplier. And so exports to those kinds of customers are important. And I think exports say a lot about the health of the trade relationship. And much to everyone's surprise, given the lockdowns last year, exports did continue to grow, as Guy mentioned. And that 28.7 billion export number in 2022, in terms of direct sales to China, that was a new high, and yet it was less than 4% of our total exports, versus 77% of our exports going to the US. So you can't say we overly rely on China as an export market. At the same time, one might think that India could be similarly large, but it still comprises less than 1% of Canada's total exports to the world. And how does that relate to our competitiveness? Well, Canada relies heavily on trade. In 2018, the trade to GDP ratio for Canada, which is a metric used to measure the importance of international trade relative to the domestic economy, stood at 66%. Was a little lower, I think in 2021 at 61%, but that trails only Germany among G7 countries, and that ratio in the US is only 25%. So we are much more dependent on our trade with the world, so it's incumbent on us to be competitive everywhere we do business, including China. And while the US may depend less on that trade, it sends almost double Canada's percent of its global exports to China. So we're just under 4%, the US sends 8.6% of its global exports. So the US may seek solidarity with other Western countries in challenging China, but it still manages to do plenty of business with China. And on that note, a particular sector of concern for us is pet food. While we know that consumption is growing in China, its population is about to drop off a cliff. We say there's 1.4 billion people. Many are saying it's already down to 1.1. And younger adults don't want to have kids, but they do want cats and dogs. So the pet industry is a happy place. It's growing in the double digits and has been for the last few years. And our pet food industry exports to 90 countries, but in 2021, China was our #2 export market, and it's been growing 22% a year for the last 4 years, up until 2021. But last year in February, China Customs stopped accepting Canadian pet food that contained poultry because of avian flu outbreaks, refusing to acknowledge a globally recognized finding that pet food is safe due to its processing methods. And in fact, the US has that same problem, but has not had its exports restricted. This gets to Guy's comment about China not applying rules in a consistent fashion. So what happened? Last year, China got almost 30 new facilities approved for export. Its exports grew almost 30%, and our exports fell by half. And many of our companies, which also make product in the US, decided to move production down there, and that affects jobs in rural communities in Canada. So for products like pet food, China's window of opportunity is wide open, and it should still be open to us. And that's why we need to keep trading with China. We need to keep a normal bilateral relationship, because otherwise we lose ground to our American competitors. And while diversifying to other markets is being done, it's going to take a long time for other Indo-Pacific countries to grow to the size of China's market, for their window to open as wide as China's is open right now for certain sectors. So we need dialogue between diplomats, regulators, and ministers. There were nearly 24 dialogues that existed before, and we argue that if you're going to bring back one, the economic and financial strategic dialogue would make a huge difference in ensuring that Canada gets what it wants and what it needs from the bilateral relationship. Thanks.
Sarah, thank you very much for that. Very persuasively laid out the economic case and a few facts that many of us wouldn't have known before. The pet food example is a nice crystallization of how these things play out product by product. So thank you for that. And having paid Guy the compliment, the moderator-oriented comment of being to time, thank you also. You gave us all of that well within time. So we're in your debt for more than one reason. And we now go to Rob. Rob, thank you, and please take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be using remarks that were written for me by the trade people, and so I can't guarantee that I'll be timely at all. They treat everything like a negotiation. I should say before I begin that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm going to speak to three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic context and the government's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'll then speak about our trade relationship with China, and many points on that have been made already. And then I'll make some comments about the way ahead. So let me start with the commercial/economic context. For those of you who are followers of global events, you will have seen Christine Lagarde's speech in New York on the 17th of April, which reflects, I think, a growing view about global fragmentation in a difficult economic context. So we have, of course, inflation and central bank monetary policy designed to dampen demand and control inflation. That's having an effect on growth and trade. We have supply shocks, the pandemic, Russia's war of aggression, the weaponization of energy in return, and the US-China rivalry. All of this is leading to a form of deglobalization. The word I've heard used is slowbalization. I think Oxford Economics gets credit for that. But I basically am seeing a landscape in which trade growth and global growth are very low. And so it's in Canada's interest, of course, to do its best to create new trade opportunities, as we are a trading nation. So the Indo-Pacific region is the region of the future. It's 40 economies, it's over 4 billion people, 47 trillion in economic activity. It's the fastest growing region in the world, and it's estimated to have 50% of global GDP by 2040. So, and those are 2/3 of those people, or 2/3 of global middle class people will be in the region by 2030. So there is huge economic potential from an export and from an investment perspective in the region. It's already a trading partner. Like 6 of our top trading partners are in that region of the world. And we have a network of FTAs that we're building out that allow us preferential market access, including the CPTPP and the Korea Free Trade Agreement. The demand for goods and services maps very well to what we make and supply. Education, health services, agriculture, natural resources, financial services, energy. and advanced manufacturing. So there's tremendous market potential there for us. So the Indo-Pacific strategy, launched in November, is a generational kind of change to target a region of the world across a series of themes, the major one of which is trade. It basically focuses on diversifying our markets and building our trading activities outside of China in the ASEAN region with India and Indonesia. And as I mentioned, we're actively negotiating trade agreements with India, Indonesia, and ASEAN. So trying to basically build more preferential access for our exporters into those marketplaces. We're also trying to play a role in setting market standards and norms. We're seeking entry into the US IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, and trying to play a role through standard setting in the region. And as I said, the strategy goes beyond commerce. It goes to defense, security, diplomacy, and development, all of which have important dimensions and interests in terms of Canada's role in the region. So turning to China, I'm not going to repeat all the statistics. I think they're largely lined up with the statistics in front of me. But our trade is dominant in the region with China right now. And China is itself dominant in an economic sense in the region. Although, as was mentioned by Sarah, it's only a very small share of our overall trade, which is true in sense of opportunity for China and the region. Our trade is growing with China, notwithstanding recent difficulties. We have seen records set. It's a sign of a changing kind of environment, and that environment includes China's openness to exports. And I'm going to come back to China from the perspective of the Chinese interest here in a minute, but let me just say, the growth of exports and imports is a sign that trade, notwithstanding all the other things that are going on, and the atmospherics that's attached to that, are in fact performing well. And however, it's a trade deficit, and it's a structural trade deficit, and it's not likely to change. We buy a lot more from China than China will from us. So turning to the way ahead, we are basically taking a new and nuanced view of the risks. The IPS has classified China as a disruptor, and that is a characterization, not a criticism. It's meant to be an open-eyed view of the world. And we are actively seeking to diversify our trade relationships and no longer saying we need to pursue China almost in singularity for deeper trade relationships. And we're with many other countries in the world who are recalibrating their relationship with China as an economy and as a country, as a government. And I acknowledge, and I think everybody understands, that there are many issues in terms of how China manages trade. There are market access barriers, there's foreign investment barriers, there's industrial policy and SOEs, and there's economic coercion, which Canada has experienced. So our message to Canada, to companies that are going into China, is be wide-eyed, be open-eyed, and know the risks. Understand what China's priorities and policies are, and understand that some are more risky than others to your business model. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but it means you should definitely own the decision. We are continuing to welcome Chinese firms in Canada, although we are also taking a more clear-eyed view of the national security risks there. And that is revealing itself in decisions that have been made under the Investment Canada Act, and will continue to do so. But it gets to the issue of basically ownership of assets and access to information to the Chinese government. The government continues to support businesses in China. The Trade Commissioner Service is active in the region and is available to companies to support them. They characterize their business model as prudent promotion. So they're working with Chinese officials on an ongoing basis to try and address market access barriers, including the issue of pet food, which we're very aware of. In the longer run, the issue here is about the rules-based international order. And here we have a kind of balanced interests. Canada obviously needs the world to work according to a set of rules, and in many ways it's not. China and the US and even the EU are deviating from straightforward application of the World Trade Organization framework, and the World Trade Organization itself is a bit moribund owing to the fact that its adjudicative function isn't working. to its fullest extent. But China's a taker in rules as well, in the sense that to be seen as a stable and reliable and transparent trading partner, it needs to abide by the rules. And they are sending the message. They're traveling the world and sending the message that that's their intention. Now, whether that can be taken for granted or believed is another question, but that is certainly the tack that they're on. And they would like to join things like the CPTPP to enlarge their trading relationships. The bottom line for us here in government is a view of balancing risk and opportunity and ensuring that we're taking every step that we can to give Canadian businesses a chance to prosper in the Indo-Pacific region. China's an attractive market. They are energy poor, they're food poor. They'll continue to buy primary commodities from Canada in all likelihood, with maybe some interruptions. They'll continue to buy financial services from Canada. Other businesses, it's a different story. We're not looking to decouple or deglobalize or step away from our trade relationship with China. We are looking to be clear-eyed about it. Thank you.
Well, Rob, thank you very much. And notwithstanding your warning at the beginning that a brief from trade officials can sometimes be a lengthy one, you were close to time, and you gave us some really key points and nuances about market access, both formal and the things that are formally committed to, and then the things that less formally happen, which Sarah touched on as well. Let me now say to the group that I was hustling our presenters along when it came to the time of their prepared remarks for the very good reason that we want to have lots of time for the Q&A. And as you probably know, but a quick refresher never hurts, because the video conferencing apps change all the time. In WebEx, at the bottom right of your screen, if you don't see a Q&A button to press, if you just hit the little three-dotted menu, it should pop up. If you send something in the chat, I may or may not get to it, but if you use the Q&A field, then we should be able to take your question, and I look forward to seeing what people have to say. As it turns out, we already do have a couple of questions. So instead of doing what impresarios sometimes do and start off with their own hobby horses, I'll go straight to John Tennant, who has asked about Taiwan, and he asked the question in a rather open-ended way: do we need a set of more ambitious and well-calibrated initiatives vis-a-vis Taiwan? Oh, I see, it's a two-part question. Well, let me just start with the Taiwan, because he has a follow-up about Australia and New Zealand and collaboration, but Taiwan's a big topic all on its own. Unimaginatively, I'll start off in the order of our speakers, but of course, Sarah and Rob, please do signal if you'd like to come in out of turn at any point. But just to start us off here, Guy, can I get you to give us your thoughts on John's question about Taiwan?
Yes, I think that we have to increase our relations with Taiwan. For one, it's an easier market than China. It's an important market. I think it's right now Taiwan is our 10th or 12th trade partner, but you have rule of law, and so when you look at what we export, there are many complementarities. So I think we should increase trade, and in fact, we should also support them joining the CPTPP.
Thank you, Guy. Sarah, you next on Taiwan.
I don't have much to add other than that, the first 10 years of my 36 or so years of dealing with the region were in Taiwan. So it's a market that I have a great deal of respect for. It's significantly smaller, right? So, the growth potential is not there. And companies in Taiwan have used the China market as a growth potential, including the company I used to work for. So there's a very close relationship in many cases between the business communities there. I think that companies that want to be diversifying are already doing so. They're not waiting for somebody to say, Taiwan is great, you should be there. If there was an opportunity there, they've probably already been looking. Any growth that's there, Canadian companies should be pursuing.
Well, thank you, Rob. I certainly have to go to you on this as our government representative, understanding that it's not easy for you to address any aspect of the question.
Not so sure. Today is the launch of discussions with Taiwan on a foreign investment protection arrangement. Operating under the One China policy, we have come to an agreement that we would set in place a framework to foster investment. We've seen quite a few delegations go to China in the last little while, including officials. We see transactions occurring, offshore wind, for instance, supported by the government of Canada, that are a sign of our growing trade relationship with Taiwan. So I would say that, just generally speaking, we're positive on Taiwan as a marketplace and want to see trade growth there.
Well, thank you. And I should correct myself. I worded that very poorly. I simply meant that there might be certain topics that would be more difficult to deal with. Not that you couldn't address any topic aspect of it to our benefit. Thank you. I did prefigure in talking about John Tennant that he had another question. And so this one is about whether we should have more active collaboration with Australia and New Zealand as part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's a bit of a double-barreled question. Can we go in reverse order this time, Rob? Can I induce you to weigh in first on that one?
Well, obviously, the Indo-Pacific strategy is a strategy for the government of Canada and its diversified interests. There are other fora and frameworks within which we collaborate with other countries, and obviously Australia and New Zealand are part of APEC, CPTPP. So there are different places to have those conversations. I'm not going to speak to defense issues or any of the issues around the geopolitics of it. That's really not my remit. But I would say that there's no lack of conversation, and they are, of course, part of the Five Eyes.
Thank you, Rob. Sarah, any thoughts on that?
On Australia, I think that there are a lot of similar characteristics that we have with Australia as a middle power, and looking at how a country like Australia has managed its relationship with China. I think some of the non-tariff barriers that China put in place on Australia when being criticized by Australia gives the rest of the world pause that you can have a free trade agreement, but if it's treated without following it, then that's a problem. And those are points we make to our own interlocutors in the Chinese government when they say, well, how can things get better? And we say, you have to set examples that make sense. But at the same time, Australia has recently resuscitated its relationship with China, and as I understand it, has done so without actually changing its policies, but more on just changing the way it pursues dialogue and mutual understanding with a country that is very different from it. And that's something that we always encourage our interlocutors in the Canadian government to do as well. I mean, we are never going to agree with China on many things, but if you don't talk about them, then you can't get anywhere. And you also can't understand what could be a competitor to you. The whole concept of cognitive empathy and people understanding each other at all levels can only be helpful.
Thank you. Yes, open societies sometimes feel very messy and unable to act with as much deliberation as closed societies, but there's a lot of strength to it in the long run. Guy, over to you on Australia and New Zealand, please.
Well, I think that there is an area where we should work more closely with Australia, and that's to counter coercive measures by China. One example, I have written an op-ed on this. If you look at barley, China imposed huge tariffs on barley because they knew they could replace Australian barley by importing more from Canada or from the US. And what we could do is have an agreement between Canada, US, Australia, whereby if one of the three is victim of such tariffs, the other two would undertake not to export more than their historical share of the China market. And there are also good ideas in the January-February issue of Foreign Affairs, in an article written by Victor Cha to counter. And I think that's, China hopefully would get the message quickly.
Thank you. Very practical. I've got a question from Van Dacus, and it's about the panel's view on the Indo-Pacific strategy and what the rest of the world thinks of it. I might give Rob a bit of a rest on this one, Rob. I'll come to you, but let's get Sarah and Guy to weigh in first, and then it might be easier for you to respond after you've heard what they have to say, Sarah.
From our perspective, we're happy that the Indo-Pacific strategy includes China, because there were insinuations that it might not, and even calling it a disruptor and taking a fairly hard line. We heard from our members when we surveyed them in 2020 that they wanted the Canadian government to have a strategy for China, even if it was a hardline one. And China often will respect a hard line taken against it, but having no line at all was worse in many ways. Chinese companies as well are pursuing opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. You can't walk a block in Phnom Penh without seeing a building that has a sign on it that it's being built by a Chinese investor. So we are going to encounter China wherever we decide to go in the world. And that's why, any smart business is looking at, how do I make sure that all my eggs aren't in one basket, that I'm developing markets where they're growing, but a lot of those markets are still very small and are not growing as fast as China, which even at its lower growth rates, I saw recently, will still contribute a quarter of the world's global growth this year. And each market in and of itself is a tough one. There's an anecdote that my colleague in Beijing uses about a German CEO who was asked about his company's Indo-Pacific strategy. And he said, here's the thing. He says, if we talk about Japan, I've been trying for 5 decades to have success there and have not. In Indonesia, I can't get a contract worth the paper it's written on. And in India, don't even get me started, he said. But in China, I'm making higher profit margins than I am anywhere in the world. And there is a system that works for me. But again, this is a company that's trying in all those markets. So I think it's appreciated that the government of Canada is trying to help companies to get into those other Asian markets. But, if you look at a pie chart of our exports, I said 77% goes to the US, 11% goes to Asia or to the Indo-Pacific region. And then if you look at that 11% slice, half of it is China and Hong Kong. So, any one of those other markets is right now less than 1%. And you're going to need the same sort of effort and activity and investment to start in Indonesia or Vietnam or other places as you will in China. So it's tougher for smaller companies in Canada to do too many of those.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very illuminating answer. Guy, I'll go to you next on this if I could, and then Rob, if you choose.
Well, I must say that I like very much the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it was very well designed, a comprehensive approach. It covers the 5 areas that need to be covered, environment, defense, trade, political relations, development. And it has a budget. And my understanding is that it has been well received in the region. I know that South Korea and Japan like the security aspects, and for that, I think Canada will need to beef up its investment on the security side. But it's a good first step to talk about the North Pacific security. And for the rest, well, they welcome Canada, but they know that we have not been consistent in the past. And so we will have to be steady in our approach and have regular visit by ministers and all this. And when I said that at the conclusion of my talk that, it's ambitious, it really is. When you look at the figures, and if I put on my hat of former DG of personnel, I know how challenging it can be to recruit people, to train people, and to deploy people. So from that perspective, it's very ambitious. My understanding also is that the submission is going to Treasury Board in a couple of months. So I think it's on the right track, but obviously implementation will be key.
Thank you, Guy. Rob, would you like to come in on the question, or perhaps in response to anything that Sarah or Guy said?
Yeah, happy to. Listen, this is the long game. This is not the short run game. And the flip side of Sarah's stats are that, there's tremendous potential. It's true from a trade perspective, we have this tremendous North American bias. That's just natural, and especially from the SME point of view. It is our job, in part, here in the trade area and through the TCS to encourage companies to go abroad. And it's going to take time, but there is potential there. I think that we are going to continue showing up, and that is the key to Guy's point. I went to the region in February, and it's very clear to me that relationships matter in a lot of countries. Knowing the key players and having a relationship with them. So that'll be the test. We've got to keep going and at the government level, in the senior corporate level, and bringing small businesses to the region, or medium-sized businesses that can export. Let me put it that way.
Well, Rob, thank you very much. We've got a question from Alex. I think it's Alex Chapara. Just before I go to that, though, I'll say I know that there's been a little bit of activity in the chat with a couple of attendees who wanted to make a comment or ask a question. If it's not possible for it to go into the Q&A, I'll ask one of my colleagues if they could just do a quick transcription so that I don't end up doing a disservice to everyone by clicking away and having an accident of some sort. Alex, if it's Alex Chapara, Alex, thank you for your question. And the question is something that actually Sarah and Guy talked about a little bit already. It's about the amount of bilateral goods trade going through third countries on their way to Canada or China, and whether this potentially understates the amount of trade between the two countries. Sarah, you certainly touched on a couple of things relevant to that. So can I go to you first on that?
Yeah, I took to heart Guy's information about, if you include gold. We know gold to Hong Kong has been a big export of late, but I hadn't realized just how much crude oil was going via the West Coast and is being measured that way. I know we started seeing direct oil exports pop up a couple of years ago when the offshore Newfoundland oil was able to be shipped. But, in general, this is energy exports are something that could radically increase our own exports, but we have a difficult time finding a direct channel to do that because of our own ability to build the infrastructure. So, I guess it's good that it's finding a way, and China does need energy. We're very keen on things like LNG that would help China reduce its coal consumption. But again, there are infrastructure barriers to more of that happening via Canada.
Thank you. Guy, any comment on indirect trade?
Yeah, well, when I was ambassador, I had arguments with the Chinese about our growing trade deficit, and they were saying, well, your figures don't coincide. In fact, we had back in 2016, during the first visit of Mr. Trudeau to China, we had agreed to set up a working group to try to reconcile our data. And in fact, the figures that I quoted come directly from a report from the economic section of the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, which is, they produce that every week or every second week, great information. And they look at the Chinese data, and that's where I took this. In fact, I was struck. Last year, Russia and China were on a gold buying spree. Russia about 24% of the gold in the world, China 18%, and that was $19.5 billion worth of Canadian gold that transited through Hong Kong. And of course, I'm a big believer in Stats Canada, but Stats Canada count this as an export to Hong Kong. While if you look at Chinese data, they count this as an export from Canada. The amount of crude oil was 3.4 billion, and again, it went through the West Coast. And so when we talk about trade deficit, I think it's good to take a larger picture to try to see, and the same thing applies to investment. If you ask Stats Canada, they say that Chinese investment in Canada is about 24-25 billion. In fact, the China Institute of the Alberta University produce a good update every year. And it's now getting close to $100 billion, which give a very different figure in terms of who's investing in Canada. And the reason for the discrepancy between Stats Canada and the Albertans, it's that, of course, investment will transit through Cayman Island or Luxembourg or Hong Kong. And so I'm a big fan of data and numbers, but all this is that we have to drill down a bit, a lot more to have the clearer picture.
Thank you. And Rob, please come in on this one.
Well, I'm going to make a couple of comments that are not directly related to the stats. First comment is obviously some of the things that are happening in the world today are taking us in a direction of having better numbers in the future. So here I would cite as an example, of course, our efforts to increase the awareness of beneficial ownership, which is a federal initiative that we hope the provinces take up, all of the provinces take up, and that has, you know, various dimensions, including anti-money laundering, but it would also give us a better read on who owns what. As well, the fact of the Russian war of aggression and the economic sanctions that were applied, leading to, you know, people trying to get around those sanctions, has led to an increased effort to monitor trade flows in a better and more accurate way. So I think in the medium term, we're going to see the modalities for that improve. And so therefore getting to, you know, who is in fact the country of origin. Just as an example for that, you know, we get a lot of pressure on the issue of steel, for example, which is, you know, can be transshipped through a variety of countries and isn't marked in its original country such that you know where its origin is. So just as an example, I think that there are things that we will be doing from a policy and process perspective that will have some impact on our understanding in the future.
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, supply chains have become more interesting, partly for trade policy reasons and partly for many other reasons. So, Rob, thank you for that. My colleague Daniel Schwanen has a question, and he's keying off EU President Ursula von der Leyen saying that the EU was seeking to de-risk its relationship with China rather than decouple economically. And he asks what our panelists think. Whether this is the best approach for Canada as well, and if so, what's the most important thing we can do to de-risk their relationship? Maybe I'll just revert back to the initial speaking order on this one. Guy, ask your thoughts on this one first, and then we'll go to Sarah and then to Rob.
Well, I would say that when we look at companies, Canadian companies doing business in China, there are three types. There's those who want to sell in the China market, those that want to operate there and have Chinese components in their supply chain. And the third is investors, and that include our large pension funds. Starting with the last, they have learned lessons from their exposure in Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine. I know I've discussed with people in some of those funds. They have looked at China, and they say, well, we cannot exclude that China may want to invade Taiwan in the future, which would trigger sanctions. And how exposed would we be? And as a result, well, for instance, the Ontario Teachers Fund announced in early February that they were having an hard look at their portfolio. They have about $5 billion invested there. I know that CDPQ in Quebec is also getting out of real estate, and so that they are reducing their vulnerabilities and their risk. When I discuss with Canadian companies, and they are concerned about operating in China, and you know, after what happened to Michaels, and I said, no, if you create jobs in China, nobody will harm you, because especially now they are trying to get foreign companies to get back to China. But it's a bit like waiting for Godot. I don't know how many times I've heard speeches by Chinese leaders saying, yes, we like you, we are opening up. It's happening slowly in the financial sector, but you know, there's still a long way to go. And in terms of supply chain, my advice to companies is, especially those that also do business with the US, is pay attention to what's happening in the US and at the composition of your widgets, because there could be sanctions there. And it's better to have a plan B in case there is a problem. And the next thing to watch that may come down the road is if there is a tax that is put on the carbon content of imports, then that would have a huge impact on sourcing goods from China.
Thank you, Guy. Sarah, your thoughts on de-risking, please.
I think the biggest way to de-risk the relationship is to ensure that there is a normal set of dialogues going on, such that if arbitrary actions are taken, if changes are coming or have just happened, that they can be addressed quickly rather than waiting, who knows how long until a next conversation might happen. Even if all it means is, as I'm sure Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi did, sat in a room and yelled at each other for 3 hours. You see that the U.S. has those conversations. They're quite adversarial, and yet they get results. China, especially in terms of the larger corporations in Canada, China has definitely moved up the risk assessment list. We hear some companies saying, well, we used to sit at our board meetings and talk more about China as an opportunity. Now, following what happened with Russia and Ukraine, we're looking at how to make sure risk mitigation is in place, make sure that what we have there now stays safe and successful. So there's less activation, I would say, given the uncertainties that are going on.
Thank you. Rob, any comments on this, please, on de-risking?
Well, I think that the EU's perspective, and I tried to allude to this in my remarks, is very similar to Canada's, right? I mean, it's eyes wide open, and events have driven that, right? The treatment of Lithuania after their recognition of Taiwan was a very a sharp reminder about the coerciveness with which China can behave. But they have big trading relationships. The EU is not a homogenous region. France or Germany, more particularly, have big trade relationships, and they want to sustain them. So it is a question of finding the right balance. And I agree with Sarah that dialogue and having access is the key. And in the context of that, holding people to account here. So this is what the EU is clearly getting to. If we can maintain fair, open, balanced, or transparent trade relationships, so much the better. If things go funky, then there will be consequences.
Thank you, Rob. We are almost at time, but the last question that I can see from Dan, I think I know which Dan, but I'm not sure, is about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, mooted to conclude by November, according to the USTR. This is somewhat insider stuff on trade policy. I'm not in a position to offer an opinion myself, but the question is, do we know what is in the negotiations? Not sure how to handle this one. Rob, go ahead, please.
Well, briefly, no, we're not a participant in the negotiations. We have a line of sight, but there is a good deal of, sort of confidentiality attached to those negotiations. So at this point in time, we'd very much like to be in the room, but we're not.
Thank you, Rob. Sarah or Guy, it's a rather specialized final question, but let me turn to you and say if now would be the time, I guess, if there's any kind of wrap up zinger that takes about 20 seconds to say, then now would be a good time for that too. Guy, any comments on that one?
Well, not on that last question, but I would say that yes, there are good opportunities with China, but the key, I would say, is to work with allies to change the behavior of China. And in fact, Rob alluded to that. In fact, we have work to do also with the US to make the WTO fully functional. Again, that would be important. We need a well-functioning multilateral trade system.
Here. Thank you very much for that. Sarah, a last comment from you, either on the question or on the big picture, or both?
No comment on the question, but as Rob says, we want and need to be at the table in multilateral negotiations. We do know that as a middle power, there's safety in numbers of teaming up with allies, particularly when trying to challenge China. But we also have to be very cognizant of what our allies are doing to further their own interests. And if those interests are being furthered at the expense of Canada's, we need to fight for our interests as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Very cogently put. Rob, I've gone around the horn offering a chance for a final summation, which I didn't give to you. So if you'd like one, it's yours.
I don't think I really need one. Thank you, Bill. If I've avoided errors this far, then I should probably stop.
Very good. Well, we really appreciate your being here. As a public servant, you have a fine line to walk, and you've always walked it extremely well, Rob. We appreciate your being here. Sarah, very nice to welcome you to the CD Howe Institute stage. I hope that this won't be the last time, virtually or in person. Thank you very much for your contribution. And Guy, always great to get your insights. Thank you as well. We'll give you a round of virtual applause in a moment, but I know that Mitch, my colleague, is just itching to put an advertisement up on the screen, or at least I suspect he is. I'm not actually in the same room that he is, but Mitch, if you'd like to advertise our upcoming event, there you go. How's that for a big topic? And we don't have ChatGPT as a panelist on that one, but you can amuse yourselves or maybe learn something by asking it in advance of the session what it thinks of this. So there's lots else good coming up here at the CD Howe Institute. And I was just about to say, that's one of the headlines, Tiff Macklem, Governor of the Bank of Canada, on the evening. It's a dinner of June 8th. So if you're interested in that, and how could you not be, let us know. But coming back to today's session, it's great that we're able to convene people overcoming obstacles of geography for the attendees as well as for the participants virtually. One defect is that you can't actually hear very well the round of applause, but let me do my best in leading it. To Guy and to Sarah and to Rob, we really appreciate you leading us in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your attendance. And with that, we are done, and we hope to see you again soon, whether in person or through the miracles of technology. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.